By the mid-1800s, Native American groups had either been pushed out of Florida or into the Everglades. Some families remained in North Florida, but they had to practice their traditions in secret. Host Rob Diaz de Villegas sat down with a panel of researchers and members of the Muscogee of Florida to discuss what they have studied and their unique perspectives.
North Florida has archaeological sites that are hundreds of years old, many that are thousands of years old, and at least one site is almost 15,000 years old. People have been here at least that long, but by the mid-1800s, Native groups were pushed out of the area by violent conflicts and the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Some families stayed, though, and intermarried with people of European descent. They passed on their traditions in secret, and some of their culture was lost. Today, we talk to members of the Florida Muscogee Nation who chose careers in archaeology and anthropology to try and reconnect to what was lost, while offering a Native perspective in their research. This is Coast to Canopy, an ecology podcast from WFSU Public Media. I'm your host, Rob Diaz de Villegas. My guests today are Dan Penton, a retired archaeologist and traditional chief of the Florida Muscogee. His daughter, Misty Penton, a bioarchaeologist and the tribe's storyteller and tradition keeper. Dr. Chris Bolfing, a cultural anthropologist. And Doug Alderson, an award-winning author and Muscogee maker of medicine. So, I want to start with something I've always kind of wondered about. Every time I correspond with you, Misty, you end a written correspondence with MVTO, and I want to know what that means and how you're supposed to pronounce the V.
Mado. So it's pronounced kind of like a U. Our alphabet is Moravian. It was first translated, our language was first translated by Moravians. So we have to actually learn another alphabet in order to try and decode our original language. It's like learning 3 different languages at one time to triangulate. But what it means is sacred thanks or blessings with a good heart. Everything that you do in Muscogee is with a good heart because you're responsible for your actions to be a co-creator for harmony. So as long as you are having a good heart, then you're in fact going to be doing good things, co-creating good things. So when I say Mado to someone, I'm not just saying thank you because that's more kind of a secular thank you. I'm saying thank you with a good heart for being a good human and doing what you're supposed to do to make things better.
Well, thank you.
Mado.
So let's talk about, just to start, who are the Muscogee people? Where do the Muscogee people come from? Chris Bolfing.
There are different ways of looking at this culturally and geographically. So geographically, if you look at the southeastern United States, you have the Piedmont of the Appalachians that go in, and all the groups that were Muscogee-speaking groups that were along the Piedmont are generally called Upper Creeks, whereas everyone that was down in the Gulf Coastal Plain were considered the Lower Creeks. And that, in your literature, is going to be like a pretty defining feature. So your Upper Creeks would include things like the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, Natchez. Down here, you would have the Muscogee, the Hidgety, then you would have some Miccosukee, and then some other tribes that didn't speak Muscogean, but were down here as well. So and just the same ways on the Piedmont, there were Cherokees that are Algonquins or Iroquoian speakers, and Shawnee, who were Siouan speakers, I believe. And so there was kind of mixture of groups, and the thing that generally held were the linguistic groupings. And so between any of the 2 languages, they might be mutually unintelligible. They might be similar, like hearing Portuguese and Spanish.
Right.
It's like, I feel like I should know what you're saying, but I just don't quite understand. And that's how they began to get distinguished. But these larger groups likely didn't distinguish themselves in those same categories. They were community-based. And the community structure of communities interacting with other communities forms a larger network. And that pattern served as the pattern for the Creek Confederacy, which was an alternative political structure than the tribal organizations that the Americans were more familiar with in the northern woodland areas. So like with your Iroquoians, your Algonquins, even the far eastern Siouans and some of those peoples. So there was a very different organizational structure, and it was all based on matrilineality. So that's another unifying feature of what makes the groups identify as Muscogee or as Creek would be like some type of shared linguistic like base, the focus on community as the central organizing principle, and sense of matriarchy and matrilineality.
So it's a related language with variations throughout. What other cultural elements would have been the same or different throughout this sort of confederacy? Here's Dan Penton.
Well, Misty and I were talking earlier today. The groupings in the southeastern U.S. were all diaspora communities after the early 1700s. Because when you had the uprising, for example, among the Natchez, the contemporary French reporters talk about the ceremonial leaders of the Natchez, which were Muscogee speakers. Half went to the Overhill Cherokee and half went to the Upper Creeks. So their ceremonial life is infused into the Muscogee or Creek ceremonial life. And that's just one instance. So every time that you had a disruption, whether it was the 1817, 1818, the illegal disruption of the town of Miccosukee by Andrew Jackson and his soldiers, they spread and they joined other groups. And the truth was that most native peoples, even the traditional enemies, were closer to each other in these diaspora communities than they were with the white intrusion. So what you wound up with in every case, and I defy anybody in the Southeast to show me a full-blood community because there is no such thing. You may have Cherokee, you may have Yuchi, you may have Hijidi or Miccosukee. And a classic example is that Seminoles are genetically, they're the same people. They just happen to be on south of the 31st parallel whenever they came into being because of the Treaty of Ghent or whatever it was that said that if you're below this line, you're Seminole. If you're above that line, you're Creek. So the same people are there, but their language is Hijidi. It's the Miccosukee language. They do not speak Muscogee. So, we're just a hodgepodge of survivors.
And so we have groups like the Seminoles and Miccosukee who end up kind of in the Everglades, and we have people who have to travel west in the Trail of Tears. But there are other people who stay in this area, but I guess not in communities that are observable from the outside. So talk about that aspect of it.
Let me tell you, you can document this because we provided a copy of this letter to the Department of Interior and to the House and the Senate in our congressional testimony. In 1947, the great-grandfather of our current chairwoman of the Muscogee Nation of Florida wrote to the president and said, as descendants of the signatories at the Treaty of Fort Jackson, how do we access services that we were promised? He got a letter back from the Secretary of Interior, of course the president wasn't going to respond to that, that said, you are obviously mistaken about who you are, because all Indians in Florida were either killed or removed. Now, please note that this was before the Seminoles were recognized, it was before the Miccosukee were recognized, it was before the Porch Creek were recognized. So obviously that was a lie. But people stayed here because they flew under the radar. And many of these communities were in areas that you have to, even today, have to go out of your way to access. I'll use Porch as an example. They were at Jack Springs, Alabama. Jack Springs is a headwater swamp. So they were just out of the way, and that's how they survived. That's how most of the people in the Southeast stayed here. And the Seminoles today, in fact, James Billy's brother once told me that he was really angry at the Seminoles in Oklahoma. And I said, why? He said they should never have allowed themselves to be removed. And I thought, that's an interesting way to look at things. But they're saying we stayed because we were intending to stay. Curious.
Yeah, so for people who were in North Florida, kind of under the radar, how are traditions passed down?
In the families.
Yeah.
Since 1853, I think that's the right date, it was illegal in the state of Florida to live openly as American Indian. And you could not trade. They made it illegal for traders to even go and visit them. They tried to starve them out just like they did when they tried to kill all the buffalo in the plains. But they did not go after certain families. And so the families, especially, if you had a male member that was more white than not, they continued. But the Creeks were matrilineal and matriarchal. So, the women, a lot of times, were the tradition carriers. They still are. They're the ones that select the maker of medicine and the makers of the grounds. It's not. The whole community may step in and agree to the decision that the matriarchs have made. But Doug and I are in our position because of the women. And they always go to our wives first and see if it's okay if they do put us in a position like that, because it affects the whole family.
During all this time, was there a structure like that where you had all the positions of, a maker of medicine and a ceremonial chief? Or
Well, my mother's father was a maker of medicine. I have his speaker staff. We used it on the grounds. I showed it to James Brown at the University of Chicago, who is an iconography expert. And he said, I have seen 5 of these in the museum. None come close to the one that you have. I love that. That's wonderful. I was selected, and I spent time growing up as a young child with my grandparents. And they selected me, nobody else in my family, to see things and to show medicine plants and go and collect things like the gallberry for the Ardbrim, because they separated all of their activities in the day-to-day life, except when they were doing ceremonial things. And they would grab me and take me, and the 2 of them would go and do ceremonial things.
Yeah.
And when I say ceremonial things, everything in life that is meaningful can be a ceremonial. Those things that they viewed that way, they made sure that I was present.
Yeah.
So that's how they continued, by example.
So if there are 5 ceremonial sticks that are in museums, I guess that speaks to perhaps that traditions weren't always being passed down. Were there a lot of dead ends as far as traditions being passed down in families?
Oh, yeah.
Are you asking if we got killed by white people?
Not killed, but people just stopped
Yes.
practicing. There's that too. Oh, yeah, there's that. Yeah, so
Yeah,
That was the most
there's-
common reason for
Okay,
community
right,
collapse.
right.
And literal intimidation by KKK, very literally. And even to this day, even though we're all mixed blood for the most part and certainly can generally pass,
Right.
when we go to ceremony, there are places nearby that the people in the community look for our guys to beat them up. So there is a strange holdover regardless of how we look. I was kind of pulled this back to the original, what is the diaspora? And the reason I wanted to pull it back is because you're talking about the people and the languages, but also overlaying that is the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, where you've got the mound systems and you've got the understandings of how people are interacting with nature. And that system, while it encompassed Iroquoian folks and the mix of Muscogee dialects, brought all of us together in terms of understanding a symbolic type of communication. And I think that made it much easier to communicate because we had a common language, if you will, in terms of our symbolic nature.
And there was a trade language, too. It's called the Mobilian language. Apparently it was used to communicate with people in the extensive trade network that existed, whether they were trading obsidian or grizzly bear teeth and claws from far north in exchange for Boosk and conch shells or carved shell gorgets and copper coming out of the Michigan or North Georgia area. And all of these things were common. And it boggles the mind because we just, in contemporary society, think about we're the apex of all of this stuff, and these were just simple savages. Well, no, they weren't. And I always like to encourage people that haven't been to the council house at San Luis to go. That's a small example of council houses in Florida, and the one that the Calusa had in South Florida were reported to be like 5 times bigger than that. That's incredible. I'm awed when I walk in and see the work that these people did without cranes. And we have so little understanding of what went on before because it hasn't been exposed to us when we're in educational settings. You need to talk about what your grandmother said on washing greens.
Okay.
How you carry on
So
the
yeah,
traditions.
and it's funny that you said this because I was hearing that in my mind, and I think you have heard this before, Rob. But when I was growing up, He mentioned he was the grandparent child. That's what I'll call it. A lot of times in the families, you can tell the child that is curious about how they're connected to everything. And we tend to, like you said, we observe and watch and see who's going to have the best possibility of absorbing all that and sharing it. And that child gets picked. And I can't say that I was that child, but I was always the why child. Why this? Why that? And you notice that your dad's family is doing things different than your mom's family, because my mom is European. And I noticed that I wasn't ever given any explanations for why things were different. So my grandmother used to, she gardened every day, but she wore a bonnet that covered her entire face, and she wore sleeves that covered her hands. And she would say to me, and I, as a child, I knew nothing about the connectedness of these two things. She would say, "Oh, sugar baby, you get to have your face in the sun." Well, that now makes me cry, because she never was able to, because she had to pass, okay? Second thing, just another example, and this is more of a lighthearted one, is she would always wash the greens, and she would have us, again, that's how you learn. You sit there and watch them as they're doing it. And she would wash them. And, washing greens is not a fun job. So she washed them once, then she washed them again, and I'm doing it with her, right? And I'm like, twice should be plenty. No, 3 times, then another time. And I'm like, why, Grandma? Why are we washing the greens 4 times? And she looked at me and she said, "That's just the way we do." So a lot of what we did, like my dad was saying, is modeled behaviors, which actions are incredibly important. Words are not as important in Muscogee. You're supposed to be responsible for your words, but it's your actions that show your heart.
Right.
And so that was what she showed me. Now, again, because I've been part of the ceremonial for what seems like a long time, and I'm still an infant in the knowledge base, I know now that 4 is a number of domestic harmony. So that's what you're supposed to do for your family. Just make sure you do everything in 4s, then you're making sure everything's harmonious. But I didn't know it at the time, because that's just the way we do.
Great story. So, Doug, I guess you didn't grow up with Muscogee culture, but you came
Correct.
to it later in life. So describe sort of how you became involved.
Well, in my early 20s, there was a visiting Muscogee elder named Bearhart, who was a spiritual leader in Oklahoma. He learned his ways under 2 medicine people in Oklahoma, kind of lasted their lines over 16 years. So I got to know him in Tallahassee, but he invited me out west to Oklahoma. So I visited him a couple times, and then he moved to Albuquerque, visited him out there. And then he pretty much said I was on my own. In other words, I connected with the local folks here, the Muscogee people in Florida. So I think he saw that as a time for me to blossom here, because I wasn't going to move out there. My place was in Tallahassee in this area. So he pretty much assured me that I needed to prosper right here and expand. But he did enjoy coming back here because it was alive in a medicine sense, because this was the homeland. So Oklahoma was not the homeland for the Muscogee people. It was this area, the Southeast. So he really enjoyed coming back here, and he felt charged up when he came here. I observed that with him. And he knew he was a healer, so he knew dozens of chants and plants for healing different ailments. And it was just amazing to watch him at work. He'd blow on people and just different ways to promote healing. It's something you don't see in modern medicine. So that was quite the education for me. So I do have some Iroquois ancestry from way back, and so those are Eastern people as well. They're matriarchal. So when I was watching the American Revolution last night, I noticed Joseph Brandt's people were fighting some of the Senecas, their own people, basically their own confederacy, and it was considered a travesty. Well, my ancestors joined Joseph Brandt. And at this one big battle, they had never witnessed so much carnage in their battles. So they kind of withdrew and said, we haven't seen, the Indian way of fighting was not to just try to kill everybody like that. So that was interesting to see that on PBS last night. So.
Yeah.
But Muscogee ways, I think, are similar. The Eastern Woodlands people have kind of the basic ways, and I felt the connection here since I first came to my first ceremonial in 1983, and I've been involved ever since. And I was pretty much chosen by Bearhart to learn medicine ways, and so I've been learning ever since as well. That was when I was in my early 20s.
So it's interesting that you mentioned learning something about your own heritage by watching this on TV.
Yeah.
And you've talked about, I guess with the diaspora that, I guess some things get lost, but then now you guys have become archaeologists and cultural anthropologist, and you're looking back. Talk about going back and learning this way through these, I guess, sciences, and how that adds to what you've grown up with.
I think since there's so little, or was so little, certainly before World War II and mostly after Vietnam, that things started popping for Southeastern Indians in their favor. You have a natural curiosity about that which is not addressed, or which is wink, wink, nod, nod, not talked about simply because you're still in a state that technically you can't legally be here. I mean, that really, when the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act stuff in the 60s is when a lot of these legal prohibitions were actually lifted. The fact that they weren't enforced didn't make the fact that they weren't legally in place. So
It was enshrined in the Florida Constitution.
Yeah, my interest in archaeology and native past was an attempt to try to flesh out what I was seeing from my own perspective. And I always had a lot of close friends in the profession, and I was very successful in the profession and I met many of what we consider the fathers of archaeology in the southeastern U.S. that were my friends and contemporaries. But it was because I had a different perspective on what we were looking at, and I still do.
Yeah.
And the more that I learn of the traditional ways, and you never stop learning unless you're dead, I find that more and more of what I encountered archaeologically, number one, I was extremely lucky that I didn't get damaged by what was there, because there are things that are, whether you believe it or not, it doesn't matter. There are things that can damage or kill you that are in the ground. You know, you just embrace what you see and recognize that people that do not have that ceremonial exposure do not understand what they're seeing, and they will never understand what they're seeing. We'll go into weeds a little bit here.
Yeah.
In the 1940s, there was a medical doctor in Savannah, Georgia, by the name of Antonio J. Waring. He published in a Harvard publication in the 1940s about the Southern death cult, or the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex. His archaeology as an amateur is the foundational work for the lower Atlantic seaboard. But he also was astute enough to say, and he published it in this book, he talks about the Creek ceremonial, the busk, and that thousands of years ago they were busking. And here we are in 1940s, and they're still busking. So in spite of all of the organized effort to eliminate the so-called Indian problem, the ceremonial heart is still beating, and it is today. And if you do Southeastern archaeology and you're excavating a ceremonial site, if you don't understand the elements of the Muscogee busk, you're not going to understand anything that you're seeing in the archaeological record. So it's kind of like Linda Shealy, when she interpreted the Maya hieroglyphics. It opened up a world between the academic people and the ceremonial people among the Maya. And I happen to be fortunate enough to have known Linda and gone to her house for one of her ceremonial gatherings with little Maya medicine people this tall running around. But both sides benefited from her research and opening up that language. And when she died prematurely from pancreatic cancer, these same Maya medicine people came and deified her. Now, that's much better than flowers. I'm looking forward to that myself. But that's the kind of interplay that I'm looking for from the archaeological profession, is that it benefits both sides of the equation, right, both the researchers and the indigenous people.
Can you describe the busk? I guess recently you said there was...
Can we follow up on this,
though? Oh, yeah, if you want to keep... Yeah.
Okay, so what I couldn't help but think of when you were talking about archaeology, I'm a second-generation archaeologist for the exact same reasons, is that I want to keep putting things together. And my specialty is actually biological anthropology, which is looking at skeletons and the actual DNA of people and what they've gone through. So for me, one of the more interesting reinterpretations of things has been Lake Jackson Mounds. and I'm going to defer to my father to talk about it because he was present during those excavations, not on the ground, but aware of them at the time. And there are definitely things that could potentially have been buried and put to rest that have been, let loose. So when you go to Lake Jackson, you're very careful if you are native about that. And you are also, if you care about the people with you, you let them know as well. But to go back to the understanding in terms of big picture cultural things, the largest copper plate ever found was found in Lake Jackson on the chest of somebody. For 20 years, the Western archaeologist identified that as a warrior king. As a bioarchaeologist, as a person who looks at bones, it took 20 years to undo that Western bias. Because as has been mentioned by these gentlemen here with me, we're matriarchal, and it's the beloved woman that's the ultimate authority. So when the bioarchaeology was done by Rebecca Story, who's very well known, it turns out that warrior king was in fact a 40-something-year-old woman. For us Native people, this just makes much more sense to us than in fact the other story did. And I'm going to jump a little bit in terms of things that as a Native person in archaeology I see very differently. And that is the cycle of quote unquote civilization. The idea that in order to be civilized, you have to have this incredibly populated area. What I would suggest is that natives consider that overpopulated. It is exceeding the carrying capacity, which is a natural thing to do, is to move out from that center and set up a different town. We model our towns on beehives, and the queen has to be able to sniff all the bees. If it gets too big, she's not doing her job. So she leaves her daughter in the old hive and goes to found a new one.
You can hear the rest of that conversation on the Coast to Canopy podcast, and you can check out the video version at wfsu.org/ecologyblog or on the WFSU Ecology YouTube channel.